Today we're glad to have Martin Jones with us, Professor Emeritus at the Math Department at the College of Charleston. He's taught in Costa Rica, Colombia, helping up here,
Venezuela.
and lived in Uruguay for a short time, visited there.
We visited Uruguay.
Right. So he's well traveled and extremely well read and an excellent. You can tell he's a professor when we get going here. Very concise and great at explaining things. But we're really happy you're with us today. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks so much, and thanks to everybody for coming. I want to explain a little bit first how this came about. We were having a discussion at Jerry and Mary Ann's place, and I think several people suggested I mentioned some ideas that I had taken from the book, and they said, "Oh, you should give a talk to the Democrats in the DeKalb County Democrats." And I said, "Well, they're not really my ideas, so maybe the best thing to do would be to have a book discussion." So I suggested that we try reading the book together and then discuss the ideas and the merits of the book and see what we thought, and then maybe, if possible, try to decide if ideas from the book would help us be maybe more successful in talking with people, particularly people who disagreed with us in the political spectrum. So that's really my goal today. Is I would like to kind of, go through and look at the merits of the book, try to find out, do we sort of agree with the author or disagree with the author? And if we disagree, where do we disagree? Do we find that the arguments that he makes are reasonable? Do we think that they are valuable in some sense or correct? And then at the end, I'd kind of like to take it the next step and say, okay, well, given that we have gotten some information from the book, what can we do with it? Is that something that we can use in our discussions with people who disagree with us politically? So that's the plan. And the title of the book, by the way, is The Righteous Mind. I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read it or not. It's by Jonathan Haidt. He's a professor at the University of Virginia. Just out of curiosity, because that might give me an idea of what I need to say. How many people have had a chance to read the book? And don't be embarrassed if you haven't. Okay, so most people haven't had a chance to read the book. So maybe what I'll try to do in the beginning here is talk a little bit about the main ideas of the book. And of course, maybe that will encourage you to read it later. You might look and say, "Oh, that does sound interesting," or "No, I didn't read that thing." But at any rate, so I'm trying to give you the main ideas of the book, and at that point, then we can try to, get some input from people and find out how they feel about those ideas. But he starts off at the beginning, and of course, the idea of the book, the title is "The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion." And the approach he takes is sort of a discussion of morality. And that his central argument, of course, is that there's a nuance in terms of how liberals and conservatives look at things morally, and that affects our political discourse and creates many of the difficulties we have in communicating to groups that differ in our political spectrums. So the first question he comes up with is like, how do we get morality? Where does it come from? And we could go as far back to evolutionary ideas of, does it come from chimpanzees, our closest evolutionary cousins? But he doesn't really start there. He kind of wants to look at, as a child, how do you develop your morality? So as you grow up, do you come prepackaged with morality so that as soon as you're born, you begin to start to think morally, or are you a blank slate and you have to imitate or pick up things from people around you, your parents and your friends and so on and so forth? And, give me the ball. No, it's my ball. So how do we decide what's fair, what's unfair? She got 2 candies, I only got 1 candy. How do we develop those sort of moral sensibilities? And there's throughout history been, many discussions about how this takes place, but Jonathan Haidt tends to be of the ilk that it's a mixture of nurture and nature, that we're not blank slates. You may have heard people who talk about language say that we're pre-wired for language, that we're not really, we don't come out, already speaking, obviously, but we come out pre-wired for language. And so we're already listening for rules and grammatical things that make sense. You may have noticed, like when you listen to little kids, I remember my niece when she was young, she came back from some trip and told me that they holded the baby rabbits. And no child has heard an adult say we holded the baby rabbits. But she was thinking rule-wise, you add an ED to the end. Today I bake, yesterday I baked. So that's the type of thing that a lot of linguists like Steven Pinker and Noam Chomsky, they seem to argue that we already are attuned to the idea that there's structures, and depending on the language that we grow up in, triggers go off that tell us how we use things like prepositions or verbs or adverbs and things of that nature. Well, Haidt says the same thing happens with us morally, that as you grow up, you already have these sort of triggers, and you develop them bit by bit with your experiences, and you start to decide, okay, rules should, they'll ask little kids, this kid didn't wear his uniform to school, is that wrong? And is it wrong if the teacher said it's okay? So now an appeal to authority, things of that nature. So they find that there's a development, as there are with many other things with children, and Haidt seems to believe that it's a mixture of pre-programmed, pre-imprinting, and then experience. But it depends on the culture you grow up in. Different cultures, just like different languages, are going to push different triggers. Some cultures may be more sensitive to things like death, or maybe disgust from things that might be perceived as being harmful or poisonous, or decaying objects and things of that nature. So anyhow, so the idea might be that we conceivably could develop kind of different moralities in the way that we develop different language methods. I don't know how many people speak other languages. I know at least one person here who does. But if you speak other languages, you may recognize that structures are different in other languages, that when you literally translate something in another language, for example, in Spanish, if I want to say, I like music, I actually say literally, music is pleasing to me. And so that structure is something that one who grows up in a Spanish-speaking culture will learn that, okay? And so that's kind of how Haidt is approaching morality. And he's saying, okay, we learn these sort of things, we develop these moralities. But then he takes it a little bit further, and he says, well, what about, how much of our thinking and how much of our morality is done with a sort of an approach that is reason? We think about things and we ask ourselves questions. Am I harming other people? Can I sort of suggest that this behavior be used universally? Is it okay for, I might want to tell a white lie to somebody, yes, you look good in that outfit. And can I sort of say that universally that's acceptable, or would that not be allowed? And so that's sort of what Immanuel Kant was trying to get after in his critique of pure reason, trying to come up with what he called categorical imperatives. What could I say everybody should do? And those are the things I should obey. But Kant and Jeremy Bentham, who was a utilitarian, those folks who are utilitarians, and some of you may have read Peter Singer, he's probably the most famous modern utilitarian, believe that the goal should be to maximize human happiness, or maybe even beyond humans, happiness that includes non-humans, but you want to maximize that. So, for example, a utilitarian might suggest that if we do painful experiments, medical experiments on one person, but it saves 50 other people's lives, that would be justifiable to a utilitarian. They would say, well, it maximizes happiness and overall utility. So if you read any of Peter Singer, he has some controversial positions, like ones about, aborting fetuses that may be Down syndrome fetuses or may have some other things. He generally feels that that family who aborts that fetus will have another child later on that will be healthy, and overall utilitarian value will be increased. So there's some ideas. I only mentioned those two because Haidt mentions those in the book. He also mentions David Hume, who tended to believe that intuitions and emotions were the base of our morality. It wasn't reason. We weren't mentally trying to figure out the truth. We were basically reacting emotionally, and then our reason was mostly justifying what we had come to as an emotional decision. So there's ideas out there. Plato, reason, that's morality. Thomas Jefferson, it's 50-50, part reason, part emotion. David Hume, it's emotion. And we're just going to justify it with reason afterwards. Haidt says that he believes kind of David Hume was probably most likely or mostly correct of the three. And he comes up with his analogy that he says there's a rider on an elephant, and the elephant is emotion. That's our emotional intuition. And so when somebody says something to us like, there's millions of people coming across the border. Of course, I've heard that expression from some, people that I've had discussions with, there's an invasion across the southern border. Well, my elephant begins to start to sway right away. I'm swaying like, okay, am I going to hear another one of these southern invasion arguments? And what do I need to do? Because I think that they're misinformed, and I'm getting ready to tell them why they're misinformed. So my elephant sways away from there, and I say something, and their elephant sways away from me. And so pretty soon we've pushed ourselves apart. Our elephants, the emotions have gotten apart. Now, Haidt says that reason is the rider on the elephant, but he's chosen an elephant because it's a big animal. It's hard to get an elephant to do something it doesn't want to do. And reason, most often, the rider is trying to justify the way the elephant's going. And you may have felt this in discussions you've had with people where you have a reaction and you start to think, well, I don't feel that way. And your rider begins to justify and starts to explain why your elephant is correct and why their elephant is incorrect, okay? So that's the sort of idea that Hume takes up as his sort of analogy for how reason works and how we behave when we begin to discuss things. Morality is sort of this elephant that starts to sway intuitively, and the rider is our reason trying to rein it in. Now, he does point out that elephants aren't dictators. They can have their minds changed, but it usually is hard to get them to sway back once they've begun to sway. So that's something we should keep in mind when we do discuss things with people with whom we disagree. Trying to establish some common ground, and I'm getting my head of myself, this is really the end of the book, but trying to establish some common ground, human to human connections and things that make our elephants not sway apart might be a good place to begin before we begin discussing things that are emotionally much more upsetting. So given that sort of idea, Haidt wants to take it a little bit further, and he says that he thinks of morality as a taste, like on our taste buds. When we eat something, we can taste bitterness, we can taste sweetness, we can taste saltiness, we can taste these different tastes. And he said morality is like that too. Now, everybody's got a theory, right? So it all sounds real good, but is there any justification for his theory? He says that there's these different tastes, and he breaks it down into sort of a care and harm. There's a sort of a feeling in morality where we want to take care of things that are helpless. We want to avoid harm to things. So there's a care harm taste bud in our morality. And there's a fairness cheating taste bud. We want things to be fair. Everybody should get the same number of candies of the kids, right? And we don't want anybody cheating in any games, and we don't want people getting things they don't deserve. So he calls that the fairness cheating. And then he's got sort of a loyalty taste bud where you want to show loyalty to your group. This probably, was something that would naturally arise in evolution, where we needed social groups to help us out, and we had to make sure that those in the group were loyal to their group. They weren't going to defect or do something to harm us. So he has sort of a loyalty taste bud. And then authority. He's got an authority taste bud in there, which, do we respect sort of authority? Am I going to listen to those who are above me. Possibly if I'm going into battle or something with another tribe, I want to make sure that there's a chain of command, that someone's going to give the directives and everybody else is going to follow them, right? We need to respect those levels of authority. Who's the chief? Who's going to decide when we plant the crops, so on and so forth. So he's got that. And then he's got a sanctity degradation sort of morality. And he comes up with many little clever stories in the book where he tries to elicit response from people to find out, does this trigger a particular reaction? I'll give you one of them. He asked people this story. He says there's a family, they've got a dog, and the dog's hit by a car. But the family has heard that dog meat is tasty, and so they cook the dog and they eat it. Okay, now, if you're like most people, your elephant has already started to sway. Okay, it's a little disgusting, right? Yeah, but then he follows up and he asks them, did they do anything morally wrong? Was there anything morally wrong with their behavior? And he tends to find that, and of course, many of the people who he talks to are his students, but he also talks to people, he lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, but he'll talk to people in the community too. So he has a variety of sort of political spectrums that he's able to talk to. He said his students typically sit back and go, geez, I don't know, it's kind of disgusting, but I guess if it's their dog and if they don't care, I guess they haven't done anything wrong. So they say, I guess it's okay, but it seems awful disgusting. Whereas he'll go out in the community and talk to some of the people in the community and they'll say, I need to tell you why that's wrong. And so their reaction is one of, that's wrong. I don't need to justify that, right? He's got other ones that are more disgusting. I'll let you read the book, that oftentimes involve, stories of things that people do to corpses and other things of that nature. But other things he'll ask, like, how much money would it take for you to slap a male friend of yours in the face as part of a comedy routine? Would you need any money? Would you do it for free? Would you need to be paid $500 or $1,000 or $1 million? So people usually think about that and they give a response. And then he asks them, well, how much would it cost to slap your father in the face as part of a comedy routine with his permission? Is there a reaction there? Which of those was easier to do? Yeah, slap your friend, but your father, it's harder. Well, that's part of that authority type thing. And this aversion to wanting to eat the family dog or to do something unusual to a corpse, like after that person's gone, you may feel like they're gone. There's nothing there, but I might feel uncomfortable dragging their corpse around behind my car for a week. That might not feel right to that. It's somehow degrading to that person, right? Or people acting in a animalistic way, dancing naked in front of a fire during a festival or something, to me feel like that's degrading, so you may have seen the bumper stickers, your body may be a temple, but mine's an amusement park. Anyhow, so there's different people obviously react to this idea of sanctity and degradation, and certainly religious groups and more religious people are going to certainly have this idea, this sanctity idea in there. So basically, Haidt tries to say, we've got these different tastes, and depending on what your political ilk is, you tend to favor or emphasize certain tastes. And his argument is that liberals tend to emphasize the Care Harm Foundation. And when you listen to speeches that are given by, say, people like John Kerry when he was running for president, or even Obama, even though I felt like Obama did much better than some of the other Democrats. But if you listen to say the last Democratic primary, when there was a big stage full of people and you heard Elizabeth Warren and you heard Bernie Sanders, there's a lot of intellectual discussion going up on stage during Democratic primaries. Would you agree? Policy discussions, how we should handle this, what should happen at the border, how we should do certain things. There seems to be a lot more fear mongering, that would be my term, when I listen to Republican primaries. But there seems to be appeals to many more tastes of morality in the Republican primaries than in the Democratic primaries. Democrats typically emphasize care harm. They want equality. They want to make sure that groups that are generally oppressed get their chances to have equal opportunities. They want to protect those groups from that. When they think of fairness, they think of everybody starting out on the equal playing field. But the Republicans or the conservatives tend to think of fairness as more proportionality. Don't let anybody get what they don't deserve. You may have seen the bumper sticker, share my work ethic, not my wealth. Okay, so this is an appeal to, you're not going to do the work, then you don't get the rewards, right? So there's that sort of idea in there of how do conservatives think of fairness, how do liberals think of fairness. Now, when you get to authority and loyalty and sanctity, generally Haight's impression is liberals don't have any use for those, very little use, and they don't talk about it. To them, authority and sanctity and like many liberals will think of themselves as citizens of the world, not of their country. They're not America first. I want to be a citizen of the planet. I want to make sure I do the right thing for everyone, right? But again, that loyalty thing, conservatives put much more emphasis on the taste of loyalty, and they're going to say America first, or take care of your own, close the border, protect me. And someone might say, well, yeah, but these other people are humans as well, and just through wherever the luck of wherever they happen to be born and the circumstances they're born in, they have things they have to deal with, and do we have an obligation to help them? Okay, but again, conservatives will tend to say no. My group, okay, I'm going to tend to be my own group. So that loyalty, authority, you know, the whole, there was a picture in the book where he shows a picture of the cup. I don't know if you know the book or the magazine, The Nation. And so they have a cup that has nation in parentheses, and then it says insubordinate in front of it. So insubordination is on the cup, right? Well, that's sort of a liberal view of like, hey, you know, authority has generally been, in liberal eyes, a source of oppression, a source of people who are trying to use might to justify their own benefits. And then he showed the picture of a church display, and it's Pastor Bill Jones, and it says, God's in charge, so shut up. Well, there's an appeal to authority. I need a higher authority. And you may see that this whole structure of sort of, I think some of the anti-feminism, the homophobia, the anti-LGBTQ sort of attitudes that are coming through the anti-wokeness that you see on the right is very much an idea that there's a structure, there's a hierarchy in society, and everybody needs to fit in their piece. And if they don't, society will fall apart. We need to have men in charge, and then women after that, and then we don't have any room for gays and lesbians. They don't fit the structure. And so you can see those sorts of attitudes very often coming through in thinking on that side, because there's a much more emphasis on some hierarchical structure. So again, Haight doesn't criticize any of these. He doesn't say that this is right or that's wrong, but he's sort of trying to explain at this stage why some people would react one way. Like, let's take abortion. Somebody might say, you don't want to have an abortion, don't have one. Well, that would be sort of a position of, okay, well, I can't justify it morally. There's no, my sanctity taste bud isn't being triggered or anything. That's a personal decision. If a person wants to decide to have an abortion, they can decide. If they don't want to, they don't have to. They can have that decision themselves, and I don't need to get involved. Whereas somebody with a very strong sanctity taste bud might say, you know, this is sacrilege against life. This fetus is part of God's plan, and so we cannot, you know, do something that would subvert God's plan. All right, so Haight doesn't take a stand at that point. He's right now at this stage just trying to get us to understand these, what he calls moral matrices. And he says different people have different moral matrices. Conservatives tend to favor all of the pillars almost equally. And liberals tend to favor only two pillars, care, harm, and fairness, but their view of fairness is one of equality and not one of proportionality. That is the structure really of the book. And the last third of the book, I think, is sort of the weakest. He tries to, his I guess, analogy would be that humans are 90% chimp and 10% bee. Bees have very strong social groups that work together for a common goal, and chimps are kind of tribalistic. They tend to, fight other tribes and so on, but are, loyal to their own tribes. He doesn't justify that, in my opinion, empirically quite as well, but he does a very good job with, I think, with the moral matrix aspect. He interviews people on both ends of the political spectrum, and he gives them these little stories, and he looks at their reactions. And you can see, if you look at some of the pictures in the book, some of the graphs, he shows that liberals put a lot of weight on the care, harm, and fairness taste in the moral matrix, and they put very little on the other three. And conservatives tend to put equal weight on all of them. So when you get to the right end of the spectrum, the reaction on conservatives is pretty much all of these things play an equal role, whereas for liberals, it's spread very apart. Care and harm and fairness are up here, and all the other ones are down here. They don't value them that much. So that's a synopsis of the book. It took me a while to get through it, but since only Jay read the book, and Jay, do you want to make comments about like aspects of the book that you think I overstated or understated or left out entirely, or the things that you would?
Well, I did raise my hand, but it's been a while, since I read it.
Okay.
But, no, that seems like a lot of what you said brought it back to me. I appreciated how even-handed he was, and it really helped me understand my family, because I have a lot of conservatives in my family. I'm sort of the renegade.
Right.
And we can all talk about things, but it really can see my brother's respect for authority, religion seems to fit into that.
Would you recap those five again? I know the two that were Democrats, but what are the other?
Right, so it's kind of care, he has them split up, but it's sort of care, harm. Let's just call them care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And so examples of those would be like, for example, care, harm. If you saw like the ads that show the men beating the baby seals on the ice floes and they're asking for money, you see them lacking that, or they show a TV ad where you see the child that has the deformed palate. And so those sorts of things trigger our care, harm kind of moral taste bud, where we see the harm, we want to care for these things. And those things are somewhat universal. And then I think fairness is pretty self-explanatory, but many people see fairness as, I want to make sure that everybody who is of equal, let's say, has equal access to something like housing, or has equal access to job opportunities and things of that nature. That would seem to be a fairness thing, particularly from a liberal standpoint. Whereas maybe a conservative might view fairness as more, hey, I want to make sure that I'm not spending my tax dollars on somebody else for their Obamacare. I worked hard for that money. I don't want a free rider. Okay. Loyalty is, how does one show loyalty to one's group? I think that, in my opinion, and I think in Haidt's opinion as well, there tends to be much stronger groupishness among people who are conservative, and it's not hard to see loyalty there. You want to be loyal to your group. You want to show that you belong and you're going to fight for that group, right? Authority, we kind of mentioned this idea of God being in charge and a structure. There was a guy who wrote to Jonathan Haidt after he put an article out in a magazine. And the guy said he was in the military. And when he was in the military, everybody followed the chain of command. Everybody followed this sort of hierarchical authority. And he said, we got a lot of stuff done. He was amazed at how much stuff they got done because they were willing to follow this chain of command and get everything done. He said that when he retired from the military and went to work for this company, everybody was on equal footing. There wasn't any person who decided what was going to happen or who was going to dictate these other things. And he said he's surprised now that they get anything done at all. So I think you can see, trying to understand the conservative viewpoint, they feel like, oh, well, liberals are just going in and mucking things up because they're trying to, they're not respecting any authority. They're not doing anything. They're not, many people that I know say, well, there's no prayer in school, and that's what happened. But I think prayer in school for them is this structure. They want this structure to society, this hierarchical structure that they feel like when that structure disintegrates, things are gone. And I recently read a book by this guy, Michael Sellenberger. He wrote a book called San Francisco, and he's a liberal. But the subtitle of the book is How Progressives Have Ruined Cities. And he talks about progressive attitudes in a lot of cities have created more of a homeless problem than need be, and you may have seen this play out recently in New York, where Mayor Adams has tried to now say, okay, if somebody has a mental health issue, we're going to go ahead and even against their will, recommend them to be in a sane asylum or get, a mental hospital or whatever else. And I remember in the San Francisco book, this author said, hey, that is, the attitude of many liberals in those cities is these people have the right to be out here doing drugs if they want to. They have the right to refuse treatment if they want to. And there's really no structure that is available to support the homeless there. And they're spending lots and lots of money and getting nothing done. So for me, and of course, the last one is sanctity. And I think we have no problem seeing where sanctity rolls in. I'm going to throw one out there just in case you can't see an idea of sanctity on the liberal end. I personally feel like when I look and see somebody destroying the environment in some way, destroying the habitat of some, leopard or some like the snow leopard, or somebody littering on the street, throwing cans out in the car, and denigrating the environment. To me, there's a sense of sanctity there that I look at nature as something, even though I'm not religious, I view it in a very awe-inspiring way, and I don't want to see it destroyed. So I would say that when I see destruction of nature, when I see somebody turn over a strand of forest to some extraction industry, to me, I feel like that's triggering my sanctity taste bud. So at any rate, I do agree, and Jay said the same thing. I do agree that reading the book, in some sense, helped me understand where different people are coming from. It helped me understand better than I did before. I think that one of the things we're very guilty of as liberals, and I'm probably one of the worst, is that we tend to dismiss conservatives as being either ignorant or stupid or uneducated or whatever else, and saying that voting against their interests. But the truth of the matter is, they're voting oftentimes in their moral interests, not necessarily their economic interests, but their moral interests. They want somebody to stop that abortion. They want somebody to put prayer back in schools. They want somebody to stop LGBTQ from running rampant for getting more rights and more focus than they should. They want a structure to the United States that puts things back. Well, but I'm going to open up to a big, wide open discussion here, but I want to read to you these two narratives, since humans, I think, we're very narrative focused, and we think of everything. The US is a narrative to us. If somebody asks you to write down, what does the United States mean to you? You might write down a story of the United States and how it started and the people who came here and how it developed and so on and so forth. but your story would reflect probably your moral views. And someone else's story would reflect their moral views. So I'm going to read two short narratives here that are a paragraph or two. You can tell me which one of these you think is the liberal one and which one you think is the conservative narrative. And then I want to ask you which moral taste buds have been triggered by these narratives. All right. So here's the first one. Once upon a time, the vast majority of human persons suffered in societies and social institutions that were unjust, unhealthy, repressive, and oppressive. These traditional societies were reprehensible because of their deep-rooted inequality, exploitation, and irrational traditionalism. But the noble human aspiration for autonomy, equality, and prosperity struggled mightily against the forces of misery and oppression, and eventually succeeded in establishing modern, liberal, democratic, capitalist welfare societies. While modern social conditions hold the potential to maximize the individual freedom and pleasure of all, there is much work to be done to dismantle the powerful vestiges of inequality, exploitation, and repression. This struggle for the good society in which individuals are equal and free to pursue their self-defined happiness is the one mission truly worth dedicating one's life to achieving. So there's one narrative. Here's another one. Once upon a time, America was a shining beacon. Then liberals came along and erected an enormous federal bureaucracy that handcuffed the invisible hand of the free market. They subverted our traditional American values and opposed God and faith at every step of the way. Instead of requiring that people work for a living, they siphoned money from hardworking Americans and gave it to Cadillac-driving drug addicts and welfare queens. Instead of punishing criminals, they tried to understand them. Instead of worrying about the victims of crime, they worried about the rights of criminals. Instead of adhering to traditional American values of family, fidelity, personal responsibility, they preached promiscuity, premarital sex, and the gay lifestyle. And they encouraged a feminist agenda that undermined traditional family roles. Instead of projecting strength to those who would do evil around the world, they cut military budgets, disrespected our soldiers in uniform, burned our flag, and chose negotiation and multilateralism. Then Americans decided to take their country back from those who sought to undermine it. Okay, so there's two narratives. Which one had more moral taste buds triggered? Certainly the second.
Yeah.
It's got appeals to first fairness in proportionality. Don't give my money to those welfare queens. It certainly has tradition, authority, structure. Do not undermine these traditional structures. Don't give women go to work, for goodness sakes. It's ruining the family, right? Okay, yeah. So we can see these structures. Don't preach the gay lifestyle. There's some sanctity coming in, huh? No gay lifestyle, no promiscuous sex. So there's a lot of moral taste buds that are being triggered in that one. Really, in the first one, which is the liberal narrative, it's only care and fairness, mostly equality, looking at making sure things are equal. Any mentions of authority are negative. Dismantle authority, dismantle traditional structures that are oppressing people, get rid of these religious ideas that are holding people down. Okay, so therein is what Haidt says is the conservative advantage. When conservatives begin to start speaking, they easily capture the moral minds of people because they trigger all these different taste buds. And he argues that he redoes in the book, he redoes one of John Kerry's speeches. And you can see that if somebody were to frame things, instead of saying, you know, America, one of John Kerry's speeches, he would mention things that George Bush was wanting to do, and he'd go, America, we could do better. We can do better. He says instead, he should have said, George, you're going to pay for that? You got 2 wars going on. You're going to pay for that? You're going to pay for this? He could have triggered our feeling of, hey, that's not fair, spending my tax money on these items right here. So I think that one of the things that come out of the book for me is that Democrats need to get off of their sort of cerebral high horses and start appealing to people on an emotional level if they want to sway people in elections. But also, I think a takeaway from the book is understanding how people think and where their moralities come from. How many people have read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell? Okay, got at least one here. How many people read, what's that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. That counts as something. Yeah, how about the book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow? Anyhow, there's a number of books out there. I think Blink is one of the better ones. I think Malcolm Gladwell writes extremely well. But there's sort of this idea that we have two systems of thinking. When you think about human brains, there are really 3 scoops of ice cream. And most animals get away with 2 scoops, and that's fine. Okay. Do we really need that 3rd scoop? You know, that 3rd scoop up there gives us all our existential angst and all these other things, right? But basically, the idea is that 2 scoops, there's sort of a reaction right away. You walk out in your driveway and you jump back because it's a snake. Oh, it's just a stick. But that first system of thinking is already going, snake, get away. It hasn't gone through your conscious mind. In fact, you probably drove down here and none of the trip went through your conscious mind. You were on automatic pilot. You were chatting with the monkey upstairs, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff that we do, which that first system of thinking can do, and it can do it fine. Okay. But then sometimes we have to stop. Like if somebody says 273 times 13.5, I'm not going to intuitively get that answer. I'm going to have to go to the 3rd scoop and sit down and figure that one out, right? So that is sort of, you know, I think in many ways, one of the takeaways from the book, that we have this emotional, quick and dirty thinking that happens first, and then reason comes in second, and we have to apply that later. A question I want to ask to you, right, in the group, you've heard kind of my brief discussion. Is Haidt suggesting that there's moral relativism? Is he suggesting that there's not really right and wrong, or that is he sort of saying that different things could be right? Eating the family dog might be okay. You know, is he suggesting a moral relativism and that we need to accept something like female circumcision in another culture? Or is he not suggesting that? Is he just? So let me throw.
And I don't know what he's suggesting,
Right.
and I obviously am going to read that book now.
Okay, that's one of the things I'm hoping I got.
But to me, on either side, there are commonalities. I think we all have morals. I think we all have things of what's right and what's wrong. I think so that forgot where I was going, but to meld the 2 together, because one side isn't going to survive without the other.
I think you made a very good point, and that's one that he tends to bring together at the end of the book. He has a section called a yin and 2 yangs, and he mentions that he throws libertarians into the group because they tend to favor just one taste. But you know, I would say that he argues that you need to have these sort of yin and yang things to make society work. And he argues that liberals may see oppression in different places that conservatives might be blind to. They might not see that they're oppressing. They might be blind to white privilege. They might be, you know, blind to another, you know, different things that have happened. But the conservatives might be likely to see a need for some structure, some hierarchy or whatever else in order to get things done. They may need to, you know, control some of the freewheeling that liberals tend to go for in places like San Francisco. So I think that's, you know, I think that's a good point. And I guess sort of my takeaway somewhat on the book was I need to be a little bit more open to where I need to think a little bit beyond the reaction I get from somebody to where's that coming from? What's triggering that? Can I understand that trigger? But I certainly feel like. Maybe before I say how I feel, let me get some other reactions on, is he talking moral relativism?
I think so. And
Okay.
I think that one thing that popped up early on in your discussion was what a loose hot mess we Democrats must look like to conservatives, you know? Really, I mean, I think it's interesting. They adhere to more pillars of, you know, or taste buds, as you say, you know, than we do.
Well, kind of look at all those last three, your loyalty, they're all the same, kind of in a way, are they kind of tied in together?
Well, I mean, they're all tied in.
And are all been a little bit religious based as well?
Again, there's two answers to that, I would say at least. One answer would be, maybe that's part of our blind side as liberals.
Well,
We don't see the nuances that maybe a conservative might see.
yeah,
The second answer I would get in there is that they're all connected by being parts of morality. So I don't think there's any way to clearly disentangle any sort of moral reaction. It may have bits of flavors from different
things.
tastes, right? Just like
Okay.
you eat a burrito and it may trigger a variety of tastes. So you might taste a little bit of salty, you might taste a little bit of spicy, so it can have a variety of tastes in there. I guess, again, I agree with Marianne. I think that reading some of these narratives and looking at how conservatives view liberals, and I confess, when I'm going to run in the morning, I listen to Rick and Bubba on the 101.7, you know. Donnie always laughs when I come in the door and I'm singing the Rick and Bubba theme song. But they, you know, this morning, Rick and Bubba were going on and on about Kevin McCarthy removing Adam Schiff from the committee that he was on, and they were loving it, that he was just like, and they had that little segment where Kevin McCarthy said we need to have integrity, you know, and I was just laughing that, yeah, some integrity, but removing Adam Schiff because, you know, he was just trying to look for problems where there weren't there and just making stuff up and whatever else. But at any rate,
Where does truth come in all this?
yeah, well,
Because we've been living lies for so long now.
well, that was one of the things that I was going to come back to on my reaction to the thing in terms of, is there moral relativism here? Going back to the rider and the elephant and the idea that the elephant reacts first and the rider reason has to go ahead and begin to do some work. My first reaction when I finished the book was, well, the reason we're different is because liberals actually let the rider do something. They apply some reason and they ask themselves, why is it wrong for the family to eat the dog? They think about it. They don't just go with the gut reaction. But when he asked the people, the conservatives in his community, their reaction is, I need to tell you that's wrong. You know, so they're not willing to apply the reason there. And so, and Paula, you mentioned aren't they all sort of religious? To me, again, as a non-religious person, I tend to feel I'm probably harshly judgmental sometimes. And I did grow up in a religious family. It just skipped a generation or something. Actually, it's still,
There's a feeling on that one.
yeah, at any rate, but I tend to feel like, well, if you would be willing to apply reason, then you would see that these things don't make sense. And so you would let them go. So if you're gonna argue, like when somebody starts with me on an abortion discussion that, you know, the sanctity of life, I have to say, well, we can't talk there because I don't go there.
You walk away, you do.
Yeah, so I just, you know,
I used to. but-
that's one of those ones where, you know, I agree. It's a very difficult question. And particularly as a vegan, I get asked lots of times, well, how can you be pro-life? I mean, pro-abortion, and still not eat meat, you know, somehow that seems incongruous to people. And, you know, I mean, I've got my reasons and I can justify them, but I would say that in general, I do hear that phone on the way. Yeah, at any rate, yeah, so it's making me stop a second. But at any rate, I would say that to me, if you apply the reason, if you think about things, you can analyze your way past a number of those moral tastes. And you can decide, okay, that seems to be a judgment that someone can make on their own, or that, for example, I don't think that if someone were to say that they feel a certain way because of a racist feeling or a misogynistic feeling or a xenophobic feeling, I don't think those are correct. So I can't, if those are moral tastes that are triggered for somebody, I have to start and say, well, your morality is anchored in something that is not correct and shouldn't be. And if you stop and employ some reason, you'll be able to see that that's the case. So my reaction somewhat in the book a little bit was, and potentially I didn't get what Jonathan Haidt was trying to give me, but I still feel that conservative morality, to me, tends to not employ the rider. It tends to employ mostly elephant. And I think that, to me, that was my shortcoming. Other thoughts?
Well, I have a degree in psychology.
Okay,
Never went for a master's or anything like that. But my thought has always been logic and critical thinking doesn't seem to be strong suits for some people that have the morality or go under all of those 5 pillars. When you gave the example of the family whose dog got killed, and so they always heard dog meat was good, so they ate the dog. What ran through my mind was, is the family poor? Is that the only meat they've had in a long time? Who am I to judge? The dog was dead. Dead is dead. They didn't kill the dog.
right,
So I went through the critical thinking steps of, rather than being reactionary and
Right.
going, they ate the dog?
right. Well, here's another one I'll throw out to you that he tells people. He says that that there's a brother and sister, they go on a trip together. They decide they're going to sleep together that night, and they take all kinds of precautions using all kinds of contraceptives. They do that one night, and then they decide they're never going to do it again, and not tell anybody. Are they morally wrong? And so again, that might push your elephant in one direction or the other. But the interesting part is when he asks people, okay, what is the moral thing that they've done that's wrong? And many people would go, well, they could have a kid with 2 heads or something. And he goes, hey, they used all kinds of contraceptives. Their parents, no, they're not going to tell anybody. So every time that their elephant was pushing so hard and their rider was trying to justify what was going on, coming up with any legitimate justifications. Again, the other side of the coin, the more conservative responders were,
That's a sin.
I gotta tell you that's wrong.
Yeah.
There's nothing for us to discuss here. So,
You think it's because they can't even verbalize it themselves? And they say, I gotta tell you that's wrong, it's because it's just wrong. And
That they,
But in
they
the Bible,
don't
it's
go
a
through.
lot of stories like that, the fathers with the daughters,
right,
brothers.
Sodom and Gomorrah, whenever
Yes, and
the
it's,
daughters got the father drunk so that they could continue the lineage and have sex with him that night. So that's when people tell me, I used to have a guy that I played music with, and he and I used to go out to Kiowa for this gig, and then we'd have this ride for 30 minutes out there and 30 minutes back, and we would discuss, he's very religious. We would discuss religion the whole way there and back. And I remember, he would tell me, how can I possibly be moral without the Bible? How could I possibly be moral without the Bible? And I would bring up stories like these stories, and I'd say, well, if that's where you're getting your morality, like
Yeah.
the Sodom and Gomorrah story where, the angels come to visit that guy, and a village people come to the house and go, put those men out so that we can use them as women. And he puts his daughters out instead. Okay, so there's a lot of moral wrongs there, but if that's where you get your morality, then, please. And I remember there was a guy that was in my department, Herb Silverman. He's written a good book called Candidate Without a Prayer. You should read the book. It's great. He was trying to overturn a rule in South Carolina that said you had to believe in a supreme being to hold public office.
Yeah, leaving what?
Had to believe in the supreme being to hold
Oh.
public office. And
Okay.
he ran to try to get it removed to this Candidate Without a Prayer. At any rate, Herb used to debate as part of school things. He would debate different preachers from around the area. And one night he was debating this guy, and the guy said, he told Herb, how could you possibly be moral without God? He goes, if I didn't have God, I would kill people, I would cheat on my wife, I would whatever. And Herb goes, well, then I want you to keep believing. So to me, again, I think there's a lot of people who feel like not only I think it's a view of human nature. Do you view humans as basically immoral beings, sinful beings that without guardrails will act in unspeakable ways? And for many of those people, not only do they want guardrails on society, they want guardrails on themselves. Like this guy here, I'll kill my wife, I'll kill people if I don't have God. So they're looking for a structure, something that would, Donnie and I watched a program, it was a series about a week ago. It was about the Mormons. And I don't know if you remember that story of the Lafferty brothers. Was that their name? The Lafferty brothers. And they were Mormons and big Mormon family. And two of the Lafferty brothers ended up killing the wife of a third brother. It was a big thing that happened back in the 80s, and eventually they were sentenced to prison and so on and so forth. It became a series, a special called Under the Banner of Heaven. And John Krakauer's also written a book that talks about some of that stuff. But one of the things that doesn't show up in the book that does show up in the series is this detective who's on the case happens to be Mormon, and it shows him kind of suffering through this cognitive dissonance that he feels while he's seeing what's going on and what's happening in members of his own church and his own belief system and all the things that are his struggles to try to maintain his faith. I thought it was quite good. But at one point he says to this other detective who's not a Mormon, he says, how can you live without some compass? You don't have a compass. And so I think I see that sort of thing, when you're talking about where does a person, some people just only go, in my opinion, with the intuition, with the elephant. And that elephant could stray in directions that if the rider doesn't rein it in, could result in the murder of somebody, could result in, any sort of heinous behavior that if the rider could justify the way the elephant's leaning and doesn't impose some kind of critical thinking, things could be in trouble. But
I was struck
Go
by
ahead.
one thing, how you were talking about the conservatives, being against abortion and this and that, and they weren't selfless, they weren't selfish things. Probably a lot of things that the conservatives protect have nothing personally to do with them, and that's kind of like us. We, a lot of us might not have an LGBTQ, but we feel strongly, to protecting that. And I don't know, that just struck me, we're both kind of similar in that regard, trying to safeguard certain things we believe in. And when she mentioned her critical thinking, I love that process you went through with the dog. But I think I do anyway, think a conservative will never give it that much thought, and that's wrong on my part. They are giving thought to stuff. It just,
Like the brother and sister thing, I was thinking, maybe they haven't seen each other since they were kids, and they were basically strangers. Could that be, my first reaction was that's bad. It's,
Right.
I don't know why, don't ask me to, think through it, it just seems wrong,
right.
But then I started thinking, well, maybe they haven't seen each other since they were 5 years old, and
Who would be saying that?
attractive strangers.
If nobody knows that it happened,
Right.
I think that's the thing, nobody.
then there's no discussion because we don't know it happened.
Right.
the flaw with that thing is they're not gonna tell anybody, so nobody knows. But everybody does know.
Right.
So
I've always said we need to rebrand the Democratic Party. I just lost my train of thought. I mean, my big elephant is when people don't wanna, give gays, leeway or whatever. But I don't need to lead with that or get emotional about that. I need to, like you said, find common ground with them first somehow, that we agree on. Because that just
Okay.
instantly.
Give me some ideas there.
Well, it's not easy to find the common ground. But some of the things that I've been trying to think of is we all want decent wages. We all want everybody to feel comfortable. I believe both sides have that true desire. A decent job to where you can, I was a single parent, raising 2 kids on my own. I did what I had to do. I worked 2 jobs for several months, just so that I could pay my bills and have money to buy Christmas.
Mhm.
And I don't think when people go, well, they don't, they're too lazy, they don't want to work. That's a bad point to go. As well, because I know the struggles. I've been there. I walked the walk. So you can work hard. You can be good at your job. But if your job isn't paying you well enough,
And you got 2 kids.
and you've got 2 kids, and you're the only income,
Right.
that,
And you're
So-
having to also carry the burden of being support for your kids in an emotional way. So you're exhausted at the end of a day that is involved more than 8 hours of work.
Right.
And you come home and you have to somehow help them with their homework or encourage them to continue getting through things. I
And
think it's
I
asking
think-
too much.
what we have to remember is compassion.
Right.
The other day, I have a conversation with one of my girls. And she told me if we did it, we're talking about migration and people saying welfare and all that stuff, they are against that. And she told me this, if we made it, we work so hard for what we have. Yeah, it's true, but she don't understand, like I tell it, a lot of people, how much is the minimum wage? She's lucky that she make a lot of money because, and she said, well, why don't go to school? Some people don't have the brains to go to school. Some of it don't have the opportunity. Like, okay, like my son. My son, I love my baby, but don't have the brains of the sisters. He worked in a factory, he don't make the kind of money the sisters make.
Right.
But he got a lot of more compassion for people around him. He's more like, if anybody needs some. he's-
Help, it's
Yeah.
there.
And the other ones, my girls, that, well, we made it, what they cannot. Even with the brother,
Right.
we did it, why he can't do that? They don't understand, they don't have the brains, they don't have the opportunity, so they don't have,
An equal footing.
yes, every are different, what we gotta do is, help each other or not judging.
Right.
Right. Because like when she said that she worked in 2 jobs for, I know what is that, I worked 2-3 jobs just to pay my bills and feed my kids.
Right. With shoes on them.
Yes. And if you have education or more opportunities, I don't have to do that because I have more income. But, we need, like I said, you gotta put your shoes and walk 1 mile
Right.
with the other people's shoes. And you see how is it?
Yeah, I think that, I did take away some lessons from the book. Hopefully, I can apply them, we'll see. But, you know, I think trying to, you know, start off and see the humanity in someone else, rather than classifying them and categorizing them right away, and trying to see their humanity and think about, you know, everybody, there's a book by a guy named Frank Bruni called The Beauty of Dusk. It's a good book, I recommend it. But he talks about, you know, the sandwich board. Or he said if we all had sandwich boards that listed the things that we struggled through, you know, the stuff that we were overcoming, you know, like, you know, my mom has cancer, whatever you want to put on your sandwich board, but the difficulties and the things that you're struggling with, you know, my spouse left me with 3 kids to raise, you know, whatever it might be. If we all were wearing our sandwich boards, we'd be a lot more compassionate, because we look at a person and instead of seeing somebody who's in front of me at the grocery line, who's fumbling with their wallet, and I got places to be and blah, blah, blah. If I could see their sandwich board,
Yeah.
I would stop and go, geez, what am I doing? And I think that, you know, when I read that Frank Bruni book, I thought, you know, I need to be thinking about what other people, everybody's got issues, and
Yeah, everybody's going through something.
yeah, everybody's going through something. I think that's something that, you know, I do recommend the book. I know I didn't get too many takers on reading it. And it's a little bit academic. The guy is an academic, but I think it's well written. So I do recommend it. And I think there's some takeaways that I think if you read the book, you'll feel like I understand better how some of my more conservative friends are thinking. And it might push us a little bit to be able to find common ground before we start the really difficult.
Did you want to say something? Sorry.
Yes, where do we get our morals unless we have something to look to guide us to have those morals? I guess I'm older than anybody in this room. I'll be 85 in just a little while. And from the time I remember as a child coming along, my dad, he was a great person, and my mother too. There's 9 of us in our family. And we looked to my father, of course, you know, he's a child. But in the book, of course, he's not writing about this, I'm sure, but in the book, he's never mentioned the fact that we're going to have to face eternity. All of us are, whether we'll admit it or not. Everyone will face eternity. And the only way that we can really have the outlook that we need is just like, you know, if you want to say in scripture, you know, we look on other man's things more than we look on ours. And that's why I'm a Democrat, because I think the Democrats are more moral. Maybe you discussed all that, and I liked what you said, all of it. And a lot of it I wasn't looking at all these years, how I looked at other people's thinking. And I didn't look at that because they didn't seem to have the morals that I thought they should have, you know. And see, I might have been judging them instead of judging myself. But you know, unless we look at the higher power, you mentioned the scripture a while ago, you know, if we're not going to use the scripture, and I know you can get into interpretations, you know, how people interpret it and all this kind of stuff, but yet there should be, and there is a superpower that's in all the Christians. And of course, Christians know what I'm talking about, the spirit. It's not our spirit, it's God's spirit. And we follow that. We may not have as much, but unless there's the bitter, you're not going to enjoy the sweet. And the Christians, just like the Democratic Party, I feel like now we're having to fight more and harder than we've ever fought. In Alabama, I remember when we were all Democrats. The whole state was Democratic. And I could go into why I think we lost all that, and I won't. But I don't mean to take up your time, but we're still going to be responsible. Whether we believe in abortion or whether we don't, you know, that's people's own choice as far as I'm concerned. But what does the higher power, what does the person that we're looking to, or the teaching that we have, what does that say about that? You know, we know what life is, and we don't know. I know, you know, you can get into scripture all together and on this kind of stuff. I know a child is alive, you know, and I don't know when that life starts. Maybe at that special time, maybe it begins already. Maybe it's already alive. You know, if you look back to when Christ was born, you know, his mother, you know, she was conceived by not man, she was conceived by the Holy Spirit.
Well, I know that Abraham Lincoln said, when I do good, I feel good, and that is my religion. And I like that. Yeah, and so I ultimately feel like morality probably doesn't come from a book or from another person's teaching so much as it comes from our ability to recognize common humanity and common vulnerability, and to recognize in other people the struggles that we go through, and to be able to say, I'm going to make sure that their struggles are not more difficult because of actions that I take. And I hope that their attitude towards me will be the same. They won't layer more struggles upon me than I need to carry. So I feel like most of morality, you know, the source of that can be recognizing humanity in other people, and also in non-human animals, you know, recognizing that even on a different level, a dog or a cat or a cow or a sheep has a life and a subjective experience, and that I should somehow respect and treat them in a way that allows them to flourish in whatever ways they can flourish. And that I should look around at other people and ask that they have the chance to flourish as best they can. And if we all give each other that, to me, that would be my moral compass. It's sort of a consequentialist type approach. I want to look at the consequences of my actions. It's very difficult to see sometimes how far those actions can reach. I go to the store, I buy a bag of coffee. What does that put in motion? What are the consequences of that purchase? I may be enslaving some person in another country who has to pick those coffee beans for a very minimum wage, and they don't get the amount of money they deserve. I may be polluting a particular area of the planet. I may be chopping down an area that was a habitat for some species that now has nowhere to go. So it's very hard sometimes to see the reaches of our actions, but I still see that as the goal of our morality, that we should try to look as far as we can with actions that we take, and try to take the actions that we think will make the world the best place for everybody that we can. I think there's some other books other than this book that go into kind of more basic ideas about morality. I think Jonathan Haidt had a very narrow focus here of trying to look at ways that conservatives and liberals differ in how they approach moral thinking. But I think the points you brought up there probably is another book that we might have to look at some of the origins of morality. He's starting from the point that we all have some moral leanings, some moral intuitions, and how they develop differently in different cultures. But anyhow, I don't want to run on too long. It's already been an hour and 15 minutes.
You did a wonderful job.
But
Absolutely.
I want to thank everybody for coming today and for the thoughts that you threw out there. I think we all can learn a great deal from talking with each other and from doing things like this. So I appreciate the opportunity and I just want to thank everybody for coming and thank Paul and Mary Ann in particular for the impetus to maybe give this a go. And
Can I ask you, in the end, are there clear recommendations, or not really clear, but any, like to both sides about how we are to deal with each other? Or,
I'm gonna make you read the book.
okay.
Anyhow, you can read the last chapter if you want. The last chapter kind of throws a few ideas out there. But
Okay.
once again, thanks and thanks to the folks.
I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks to the folks on the Zoom.
Thank you.
What are you gonna